This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. So hello and welcome to Chthonia Conversations. I'm really pleased this week to be talking with Jake Stratton Kent. Jake is one of my favorite authors, actually, in the sort of esoteric kind of a realm. He's written a number of books, one which certainly influenced my work with Death and the Maiden, which was Sophia, 2-volume set, which talks about the Argonautica in particular as this kind of magical kind of journey. But he's written a whole bunch of other things, True Grimoire, Testament of Cyprian the Mage. There's a whole lot of others that that come to mind, too numerous to mention. And this is something you've been doing for about 40 years, I think, right, Jake? At least 40 years?
Something like that, yeah. I've got better.
You've gotten better over time. I think what I saw was actually it's longer than that, because I think I said that you started somewhere probably the same year that I was born, actually. So it's been a while. It's been quite a while. So anyway, so welcome, Jake. It's really good to have you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. So the topic that we were going to talk about today, that out of many, is thinking about the subject of archaic Hecate. Or Hecate, I think, as you like to say. And the questions that I had, because when dealing with the subject of Hecate, she's there's kind of two. I always talk about at least two different Hecates. There's sort of the archaic one, which people because we always tend to think Hecate as being associated with magic and ghosts and the moon and witchcraft. And I think a lot of authors seem to think of that as a progressive thing, sort of like in the ancient times, she was something totally different. You look at Hesiod's Theogony, where he refers to her as this, exalted goddess that Zeus loves. And then there seems to be this kind of shift. But I think your view on it is actually a little bit different regarding the archaic Hecate. So can we start by just talking about what your view is?
Well, I think the late Hecate goes off in two directions. There's the ghostly, witchy, magical one, which is partly literary, but definitely not completely. And then there's the Neoplatonist, sort of, soul of the world, anima mundi sort of thing. They're both quite late, I think. But there might be more continuity with the more witchy one that appears. But if you look at the early Hecates, I think the chthonic quality is quite clearly marked. There's some early pottery from Boeotia, where an image that looks pretty much like Cybele, sitting down on a throne flanked by lions. You don't get much more chthonic than Cybele. I mean, she's a mountain mother, goddess of that mountain, and the miners working underground. I mean, you're getting pretty chthonic vibes there. Mm-hmm. And there's the Potnia Theron connection as well. Mistress of Beasts seems to be an early quality. So yeah, I don't think we can dismiss the late Roman sort of witchy one as an aberration. It's got spookified because Galicia and things like that have been effectively demonized since the Archaic period. But in the Archaic period, religion and magic coexisted much more. So I don't think there's much problem finding an ancient chthonic Hecate. So yeah, that's my initial feelings.
Yeah, that's it, because there's a lot of different inferences there, and certainly with Goetia, I mean, that's certainly your topic. That's the one that you've written quite a lot about, and but there's a lot of people here who probably don't understand what Goetia is. Maybe we just say a couple things about because people's impression of Goetia is probably like the Solomonic grimoires and things like that, which we know it's actually much it's a much larger definition than that.
Yes, I mean Goetia comes into the literary record in connection with the Idaean dactyls, Orpheus, initiations into mystery cults. And the Idaean dactyls are specifically referred to as goets, wizards, but they're also the founders of mystery cults and generally good guys. Another interesting thing about them is that they're metal workers, which kind of connects them with the mining theme going on with Cybele, although that was more to do with obsidian,
Right.
metal. But the subterranean thing is still there. So goetia is an ancient Greek word, and it's an indigenous word for whatever magic used to be before this split with religion happened, and they had to start making excuses for magic. Like say, well, it's magia rather than goetia. Well, magia is still bad. Well, it's theurgy rather than goetia. Well, yeah, but you're borrowing lots from dodgy places. So, and goetia is archaic. And this is what I was saying about the late ooky spooky version of Hecate that the Romans have. That is post-demonization. The archaic Hecate would have been pre-demonization, when goetia still had, not an antisocial role, but a role in the community.
Right, because certainly by the time we get to Plato, and part of the problem is that a lot of people think that Plato is sort of, even a lot of scholars talk about Plato as though Plato sort of represents,
all of ancient Greece.
All of ancient Greece. That's right, the Archaic period. And that was certainly one thing I discovered, because after I'd read your book, I started to do a lot of research on that particular topic. And the more I read Plato, the more I thought, no, this really doesn't have anything to do with what came before. It's sort of a rationalization of what came before. It's a way of trying to take, the Greek gods and say, they're
personified moral forces. They never do anything naughty. They certainly don't turn into animals and chase nymphs. So the whole mythological narrative has been dismissed as wrong, and the Platonists and Neoplatonists then go on to redefine it in terms that don't really fit the older stuff.
No, exactly.
If you want to understand the Platonists, but if you want to understand what went before them, then Plato's an obstacle.
Well, exactly, and that's the way I feel, and I think that's a hard thing to get across from people, because I don't think people know how to really separate that. Like, there's this idea of high magic, the theurgy that's high, we're doing good spiritual things, as opposed to those people who are doing naughty things like putting curses on people and trying to get money, or trying to it becomes it's not hard to see how this ends up being kind of absorbed into like a Christian moralist kind of a narrative as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's interesting, and so again, I think people tend to think of Hecate as sort of being demonized along with the rest of the female lot, sort of later on. But there's a certain attributes of Hecate that I think are interesting, that I wanted to ask you about, that you've talked about in your work, and so one in particular, she has this connection to gateways and to keys, to like Chthonia and to goddesses like that. And I remember reading in and I remember reading in one place where somebody was saying that was evidence of sort of her chthonic backstory, but then there were the person who was writing this was saying, well, I don't know why that would prove why that's chthonic, so maybe we want to talk a little bit about that. Her gateway, her thing is a gateway, or is this just has to do with the liminal moving back and forth like a psychopomp? Is kind of the idea there?
Yeah, the psychopomp quality is pretty key, and I think that it's not just me that thinks so. It's in Lewis' thesis about the origins of theurgy. I think there's a previous form that the Neoplatonists adopt, which is a guide of souls, but and necessarily involves the post-mortem state and the chthonic region in the process. You can't be a guide of souls without people dying. Unless it has something to do with the dead, and everywhere you look, that is quite clear. I mean, she's a friend of Persephone when Persephone is having a hard time.
Right.
But often bears the same titles as Persephone, like Kore. Really, the only major evidence, so-called, for her being not a chthonic goddess in the more ancient period, it's a guy called William Berg, who I think he wrote for Brill, so it's going to be pretty hard to get hold of. But he says, she's a Carian goddess. She's a goddess of the Carians, and they, Carians often have theophoric names involving hers, like Hecate, that sort of thing, as personal names, and you don't do that with ooky spooky underworld deities.
Right.
Yeah, well, there seems to be rather a lot of people called Dionysus, who's definitely chthonic. And then there's Hephaestion, for instance, seems to be named after Hephaestus. The Hephaestus was bits. So I don't think that holds up. And the other problem is the Carians in the early period in the country they claim as their own. In the Neolithic period, there's nothing. Yeah, and they seem to have spent rather a lot of their time as mercenaries and pirates around the entire Mediterranean, and their origins are very mysterious. They may have been Greeks who learnt another language. They were certainly under strong Greek influence. Maybe it's because they were mercenaries and that they adopted a liminal goddess as their own. So that evidence doesn't really amount to much because the Carians are too bloody mysterious to start with. And the other part of his evidence, or thesis rather, is that she might be descended from Middle Eastern solar goddesses. And I don't think that disposes of anything either. Despite Dieter Betts saying that Helios seems to have become chthonic in the PGM. I don't think that's right. I think Helios had always had a chthonic role. Why else would he have a boat that he could lend to Hercules to cross great waters, like Rag in his boat? And the outline of a crater, Greek word for boat, looks very much like Ra's boat, to be honest. So, yeah, I think there's always been chthonic edges to solar gods and goddesses. Shamash, for instance, is the great lawgiver of Mesopotamian culture, sun god who goes into the underworld, and he does all his most important stuff down there. That's where he becomes the prototype lawgiver. So yeah, sun gods, connections with sun gods don't disprove chthonic connections. The sun's journey through the underworld is an important part of their myth umpteen times out of 10. And Apollonius of Rhodes doesn't seem to have any problems with it either. I mean, he made a big thing out of Hecate having to avert their eyes as they left the ritual site, all the old chthonic stuff. I think he's actually pretty bloody old. Apollonius of Rhodes was extremely well read, besides which he wasn't so much a philosopher as a poet. And the philosophers don't like the poets because they tell untruths, i.e. the original form of myths.
Mm-hmm. Right, which is one of Plato's complaints there in the Republic, that poets and artists and they create images. Well, also what you were saying about sun gods, because Helios is certainly connected with Medea, as I was just talking about this week. She's granddaughter, and so connected with Circe or Circe, the witch, and also there's a lot of these connections I've noticed between Apollo and because we were talking about men as well, and men is sort of being this other version of Apollo. So
they're totally syncretized, and men is lunar rather than solar. And Apollo has a silver bow, which is much more lunar than solar, but we can go into that. And Hecate's name is translates according to some as far darting, which is similar to this idea of Apollo shooting plague arrows, and perhaps connects with the Artemis Diana connection as well. So sorry, went off on a ramble. Back to you.
No, that's fine actually. No, because I was just thinking about Apollo in terms of because there was a connection. I'd written this chapter on Dionysus where there was this connection sort of between Orpheus and Apollo, because because there's this idea of I'm trying to remember what the exact connection was, but the idea of Orpheus as a priest of Apollo, and that somehow this was offensive at some point to Dionysus, who had, when the Maenads chop his head off and keep it. But Orpheus, of course, also is part of the Argonautica as well, which,
his own version of it.
It's and the Argonautica is fascinating because it's so interesting how you have this sort of cast of characters, these sort of sorcerers and these prophets, really. You have a lot of prophets. You have all the ancestors. You have, and then you have the boat itself, which has got the Oak of Dodona, which sings and prophesizes. Anyway, that's kind of going off on a tangent a bit, but it's
good. Tangents are great.
It's right. Rather than it's, but there just seems to be this. Kind of interweaving between the three of them. But if you could talk a little bit to me, just sort of clarify some of the things, because the connection to men, and I remember you had mentioned the I think it's Myasians in the Argonautica. I think I'm saying that right. And I remember looking for that section in there, and I'm like, I didn't quite follow the Hecate Artemis connection there. Can you say something about that, or?
Well, I'm not sure how to pronounce it either, but Lysia is meant to be the prototype, if you like, or at least a strong type of the mourner at funerals. Their funeral ceremonies, involved, the whole mourning, wailing thing that connects with the etymology of Galicia itself. And yeah, there's certainly got a goddess stuff going on in some of the rituals, and dying god stuff going on. How closely it links to Hecate is difficult to say, because there's a whole complex of goddesses getting likened unto each other. But yeah, Mysians and their rituals are certainly appropriate, shall we say, in the context of the chthonic goddess. Yeah. And it's probably easier to refer people to the Argonautica than it's just you take the principal site of goddess worship and magic in the Roman period is at Ephesus, where you have first the Temple of Artemis when it was Greek language, and then the Temple of Diana when it was Roman language. But we don't really know who that goddess is originally. She's archaic and goes back a long way. What we do know, however, is that both Cybele and Hecate had shrines in the main temple, and there was festivals of Cybele certainly in the town. Very, very surprising. The magical center of the entire Roman world there. And then there's the understrata. Whereas the Carians don't seem to have any archaeology in the place they said they were born. The Ephesian stuff is massive. It goes back forever. It connects with neutered priests and all sorts of stuff going on throughout what we now call Turkey. And the Galli, for instance, come from another region, but they were definitely in Ephesus. So there's no getting away from Hecate connecting with a great goddess. And some of them are only shades of each other, or at least that's to get as close as we can get to them. The distinctions may have been lost before people were even writing stuff down, but somehow they merged in the collective memory and in the literary output that followed. Which, takes us a long way from Mysia, but it kind of draws the loose ends together. I totally recommend that listeners grab a copy of the Argonautica, because there's so much going on there. And each section can be analysed. Be a podcast in its own right.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. And and it's, well, that's why I said I think you more or less do that in Gia Sophia. It's a sort of a section by section analysis of what's going on. And I find I've probably read it 10 times and I'm probably still missing stuff. It's just
Argonautica was, once I realised it, it was the ideal string for everything I wanted to bring together. And the deeper I went into it, the more I found that these ancient weird philosophers were writing books about the Argonauts as well as the various other things they got up to. Catalepsy, the Argonauts, some mystical stuff. That's the output of all of these weird blokes. So they knew before I did that the Argonautica strung all this stuff together. Yeah,
and it's it's definitely, I mean, from a strictly scholarly standpoint, like somebody who teaches this, say, to students or whatever, it's definitely very different from any of the other epics. And you get the impression it's later, but it's actually so much older. One of the things, though, I wanted to think about, if I could just shift up a little bit, is people have asked me about this as well, and I have my own answer to this, but it's kind of the Artemis connection, because Artemis with Hecate, I've often said that Hecate is sort of the underworld version of Artemis, like that they're almost mirror images of each other, because in a weird way, they almost have similar overlapping kinds of roles. And I think, my microphone's screwing up there. I think it's going to be interesting when I edit this. So I don't know. So there's this idea that Hecate probably was some kind of an older deity, that she was around before that, and somehow, like in the Olympian era, that she got kind of merged with Artemis in terms of her things, because Artemis actually she can be quite a violent deity. She's quite it deals certainly with violent death, and also a lot with the transitions of women, which to me connects her with Persephone as well. That shift. So it's and you've drawn a lot of parallels with the Artemis thing, certainly from a lot of different perspectives, including later ones like astrological ones and so forth. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, sometimes late antiquity is a good place to look back at earlier antiquity, rather than deriving our later stuff from it. We can look back and see what preceded it, what were they drawing on, what imagery they were drawing on. Forms of Artemis are pretty abominable. I mean, talking about some bonfires with piles of animals inside them, things like that. So you can understand to an extent why philosophers might want to clean it up a bit from that period. But yeah, she's definitely a chthonic goddess, a great goddess, mistress of animals, and they all do kind of converge at some point. But late antiquity is useful because of the astrological layer, if you like, which, although it produces problems, it's a language that they were all using. And lunar goddesses, like Diana, Artemis, Hecate, and so on, they become semi-interchangeable, even though the lunar connection might not be connected with all of them. The Earth is a really important place for the older forms of them, but the moon does come into it. For instance, if we take men, the god, as the spouse or whatever of Hecate, he's a lunar god and a chthonic god. So she was at least sympathetic with the moon in the early phases, even if we can't definitely. Maybe she just liked lunar guys. But it kind of works. It gives us an angle in.
Right, because it's because it's interesting. So because certainly the just thinking about that too, about her connections also to childbirth, things like that, which maybe it may not be that odd when it comes to the chthonic. That may not be that odd because because of the closeness of birth and death. It's they sort of, but she has this sort of very strongly protective kind of that seems to be another thing. And the question always is, what is she protecting from, and how does her protective role get her to becoming sort of this queen of ghosts, this leader of these hosts? Like, does it, Sarah Giles Johnson will say, okay, yeah, she clearly had this role, but like Hermaeus has that role, but he's a psychopomp, but you don't see him following the same kind of a trajectory. And he's not a leader of, bands of ghosts or spirits or, this kind of wild hunt kind of a thing. So it's
but that may connect with the demonization of women, of course, and there's just a lot of angles on the great goddesses, and some of the cultists were meant to dictate what was a good path for a woman, which is becoming a nice quiet wife, produce children, etc. And if you didn't do that, if you died unmarried or you lost your children, all that, there's a chance of you becoming a demon in the afterlife, stuff like this, which is social manipulation in the pagan world. And there's aspects of that I definitely don't want to emulate, regardless of how important I find goddess X or Y. Proper roles for females and becoming demonic if they don't follow them. That's definitely in the symbolism of a lot of the goddess cults and the festivals involved. And sometimes there's a reflex of the goddess who is the dark side, representing these unfortunate women, who become demons. So Hera, for instance, has a relationship with Lamia.
Yes,
be positive. That sort of thing. And so there's not all aspects of the archaic cults were positive from our modern perspective. I don't always want to emulate them. At the same time, my spirits aren't keen on having any Olympic gods represented in their space, with the single exception of Artemis. The statue of Artemis, we're fine. Don't bring Zeus in here. Don't bring Apollo in here. That's subjective but meaningful.
Yeah, well, but it's but that's part of it too. That subjectivity of what are the actual likes and dislikes of these kinds of entities, and their spirits. I always talk about things on this in terms of very psychological stuff, but there's a reality to it too, that in people's work, and that's not I don't use the phrase merely archetypal because I think archetypal refers to something numinous, but it's often interpreted as something merely, a mere mental construct, which is where the problem comes in,
So what Plato meant by his forms, which have been, compared to, Jungian archetypes and so on. I mean, they are definitely real, more real in mental constructs is not what he meant, and not what a lot of other people mean. Useful word.
Yep. Right. Exactly. It's it's a construct, but it's not always used in an appropriate way. So when I use the term, I always find myself worrying that people are thinking that I'm just saying like, all these things are just, these cute. And I'm like, no, not saying that at all. Not saying that at all. No. And it's, so I guess, let me see, I'm just thinking about what else I had wanted to ask you. I did want to ask you, you mentioned in a couple of different places, and it was both in Cyprian, I think, and in Geosophia, you talk about the idea of Hecate with one sandal. Like with Jason with the one sandal as being, you said that's a symbol of Hecate. I was like, I have never heard that. Like, where does that come from?
Well, there's traces all over the place, and it may connect with other great goddesses too, because Jason originally carries Hera over the river, and he's one sandaled at that time. It might connect with actual battlefield practices that soldiers only wore one shoe so they could get more tenure with the barefoot. And there's all sorts of angles on it, but there's a list of 28 symbols of Hecate in one of the PGM rituals.
Okay.
21 of them are animals, and then there's another 7. A herald's wand and a sandal amongst them. It's just one sandal. Then you get Empedocles. His legend, he apparently walked around in bronze sandals, although that might be a mismemory. And he's said to have died by jumping into the crater of Etna, and the only trace of him was a single bronze sandal. Empedocles, very interesting chap, but it was known as a goess by various people, before it was necessarily a bad word. And the connections with Hecate and Hephaestus are definitely there on site. And it turns up various other places as well. But it's one of the 7 symbols that aren't animals in a script which is Professor Betts connects with, and all the cult of the Idaean dactyls. This is straight from a mystery cult, which definitely had a thing about Hecate in it. Sandals a symbol. Yeah. Right.
Now this was more the I would imagine this is more the mystery cult of Ephesus, with the Demeter cult and that sort of thing being, I would think particularly Hecate's connection with that story. As per Homer, well, Homerica, we won't know that. I don't know it's Homer, but it's per that hymn to Demeter, where Hecate is mentioned.
No doubting that Demeter is a chthonic goddess whatsoever. I mean, the dead are known as the children of Demeter, and the mother-in-law of the god of the underworld, and all this stuff. So there's no problem associating. If Hecate is connected with Demeter, but that's another chthonic sort of connection. As I say, it's easier to disprove the idea that she was unchthonic, because the Carians are just not a reasonable, reasonable foundation for that.
Well, and the Carians are quite late, aren't they? Because the temple at is actually like what 125 BCE. Yeah. It's
So that seems to be the main support for the non-chthonic idea, and it's not very strong. It's rather flimsy. Everything else, But then there's this misunderstanding that chthonic just means ooky spooky. No, there's benign roles all over the place in the chthonic cultus. And why wouldn't there be? I mean, a psychagogue is a benign role,
right? Mm-hmm.
And this Syrian goddess that Professor Louis speculates on precedes the theurgic Hecate. She's definitely guiding souls from the earth plane to the moon. The moon is like has a major role in sorting different people's eschatology out. Once you get there, you're not doing too bad. So, but there's all these demons in the lower atmosphere who will be trying to stop you and drag you down. And Hecate and whoever this Apollo chap in the Chaldean oracles was, possibly men, they're both in roles of protectors of those souls in a precarious point in their evolution. So yeah, there's definitely benign roles for the chthonic. They're not just about ripping entrails out and having oracles that Pompey's gonna lose his battle like a Rick.
Right.
I mean, yeah, a Rick foe isn't the only way chthonic goes. Any more than self-righteous vigilantes is the only way that the others go. Yeah.
Well, that's it. I think also when you get to that later period, that kind of post-Platonic period, you've got this. You're already looking at this kind of separation, because certainly before that, when you're talking about the underworld, you're not talking about judgment. You're not talking about judgment at all. I mean, this idea, like with the Plato's vision of where oh yeah, all the good people who happen to all be philosophers, they're all the ones that sort of rise up and have memory, and then all the other ones are sent down to Tartarus, because now Tartarus is for everybody and not just for the really really shit people. And it's it's but it's interesting to me, because if Hecate sort of has this sort of original sort of protective kind of a role, then what the Neoplatonists end up doing is they kind of have this, that Hecate Soteria, the savior Hecate, who is now has another nature, I think they call physis, who is actually considered to be separate, which has to do more with the material, because the material is more dense, and it that the dragging down of the material world. Which I don't know. To me, that sounds like this is sort of I think it provides a really good foundation for a very moralistic religion and for a moralistic way of looking at things. And like you're talking about with the separation of religion and magic.
Yeah. Which is thousands of years earlier. Yeah. Yeah. Harder to draw out. So yeah, the Chaldean oracles have become a very convenient way of getting rituals for Hecate and understanding Hecate and so on, but it's a very late idea. I mean, it's not even from the pre-Christian period. Yeah. So yeah, a bit of inconvenience in tracing the earlier Hecate is what's required. Unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's difficult, and it's interesting because one of the things that we talk about now is we talk about like there's a lot of talk about the TikTok witches and the people who are kind of gotten into this. I actually know I know a wide variety of people, and some people are sort of interested, but kind of going in that direction. I'm like, well, I'm not sure that's the direction you really want to go in, but I mean, whatever everybody does, right? But it's but I feel like Hecate is one of the, I think she seems to be very interesting. One of the reasons I'm talking about her now is because it's something like I did podcasts on Hecate. I did 2-part one. I have like 20,000 views on that versus everything else. Like people are really interested, and so I think that's why I think it's kind of important to talk about what actually are we really dealing with when we're dealing with Hecate. I mean, there's that more Neoplatonic Hecate, and then it's like, well, yeah, but if we're getting down to the essence of actually who and what she is, I don't know. I mean, yeah,
it's not bad. I don't think Hesiod is a witness for the prosecution either. No. He makes he gives a part rule of the three kingdoms, which you can only really connect with Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades as sort of co-executors. So you've got the air. Well, that's the region that souls have to ascend through. Then you have Oceanus, which already connected with the underworld in all of Greek tradition. And then there's the earth, where you get Pluton, the fruits of the earth. That's a positive aspect of Hades, the just lord of the underworld. So none of it really disposes of a chthonic vision. As long as you've got spirits rising through the air or living in the air, which you can trace in lots of folklore. And there's goddesses who live in, during the spring they come out and rest in the trees, and you can hear melusine. Melusine is a Czech word for the wind whistling in a chimney. but it's also the name of Melusine, the queen of the sylphs. So
right.
so the connection of dead souls and spirits with the immediate lower atmosphere and possibly higher up, is already there in the more primitive forms of Greek tradition and the surrounding area. So all three kingdoms, she could still be a chthonic goddess. Hesiod does not dispose of her as a chthonic goddess. He just obviously has a positive view of chthonic goddesses, and he deals with the dead quite extensively. The age of heroes and so on. Heroes are dead people who have cults. You can still talk to them. There's nothing anti-chthonic about Hesiod whatsoever. Even if he is a later witness, he's earlier than a lot of the others.
Well, exactly. He's definitely earlier than the others, and it's. But he also talks about that. That was another thing. I think it's in Catalogue of Women, and he's not the only one who mentions it. It's in the Epic Cycle somewhere too. I want to say it's in the Cypria. I could be wrong about that, but he talks about Hecate or Iphigenia. Okay, the one who's sacrificed to Artemis allegedly, or depending on the ending that you pick. But that in his version, she becomes Hecate. Iphigenia becomes Hecate, and that seems to be a connection with what you were saying earlier about the women who don't fulfill a certain social role and die at a certain point. Like Iphigenia becomes that, becomes that, where you see that connection with the Lamia, because I think at some point Hecate is also called the Queen of Lamias, as well. It sounded like it was plural, but it was just, I think of one Lamia, but there could be many of them. I don't know. So it's it's just interesting because to see where these associations aren't far back, but really we don't know anything. I mean, there doesn't seem to be anything definite about Hecate probably before like the 600s maybe, around that time.
Some of the earliest pottery so 6th century, but and she's definitely here now, and she's going to be a goddess of the witches. We got to deconstruct this goddess of the theurgists, because a theurgist is not a witch, and vice versa.
No, exactly, and it's so there's definitely a shift in thinking there. But I also think, it's not just true of Hecate, it's true of a lot of goddesses that people worship today. That's a frequent. I had this conversation with David Beth just recently, where we were just talking about how, the way in which, like, he's having me do a book on Morrigan, and he's just like, people will offer like a basket of apples to the Morrigan, or we'll offer, do certain things. These are goddesses that wanted blood sacrifice, and it's not. It's interesting because it seems like it's a way of people trying to connect with the feminine, or trying to connect with that side of the feminine that's supposed to not fulfill that social role, that's not supposed to be nice and somehow. But at the same time, doing it through means that I feel are very much still stuck in that way of thinking of, well, I only do good magic, I don't do bad magic.
Sanitized magic. And it would be an awful shame if this massive upsurge of interest in Hecate just turned her into yet another sort of sanity. So let's not do it again.
It's it's not no, and that's, but it's, I don't know, it's interesting. People seem to go in stages with that. They start with you see people who will come out of these traditions. I can point to myself. I started life as like a very strict Catholic, and like thinking about going into a convent and everything else, and then had these kind of experiences that drew me away from that and into this kind of a thing. But initially, that's the way I thought about it too. It was just kind of like, oh, well, you're only going to do good. You're going to stay away from all the bad stuff. And after a while, you come to realize there's really no distinction between the good and the bad stuff.
That's a transitional stage, I think. When people get into magic, it takes a while to accommodate their minds to how magic actually works and operates. And we do impose all sorts of values on it that aren't necessarily native to it.
Right. But I think that's part of this too, is that, with Hecate, when we talk about this whole discussion of where was she before and where was she and what, what the theurgists did with her and so forth, it just feels like it's, there's, it almost kind of embodies that complexity. You know what I'm saying? Where are we really and what is it really? Because, you always start with this kind of lighter, fluffier version. And then as you move into it, you come to realize you're like, oh, there's a lot more going on here. The hole goes down quite deep.
In human terms, we do have to get used to the symbols that we've adopted or that have captured us. We're not going to get it straight away, and maybe we need to think it's nice before we can realize it. It's more multifaceted. It's
right.
just a stage of our growth.
Right, with that kind of a thing. Well, is there anything else that other thoughts that you had on the subject? Because I sent you a whole bunch of questions and thoughts and things.
I can't look at them now because I'm looking at Zoom. Well, we're done with the Carians. We could sort of talk a bit more about just the Athenians, because there's quite a lot of evidence going on there.
Okay.
And there's Pelasgian tradition in Athens before there was philosophical tradition.
Right.
And Hecate is definitely amongst those identified as household deities in traditional cults. And household deities tend to retain a lot of the more ancient aspects of the state version of the same deity. And the fact that she's amongst the household deities, is certainly indicative of that. I'm not saying that all of the deities who had household cults were chthonic in the later period. I mean, you find Zeus, for instance, amongst them, and Apollo. But Apollo definitely has traceable chthonic roots. And Zeus, well, he also has terrestrial and nighttime roles. I mean, we're used to thinking of this form of Zeus who sends thunderbolts during the day, but there's another side of Zeus who sends them during the night. He has a different name, which I can't remember right now. But there's Dispater, there's idea that the god up there is also the god down there.
Right.
So even Zeus being amongst those household deities, doesn't invalidate the fact that they are primarily chthonic. There's another weird aspect of Hecate is that some authors find a link with Athena. And she's definitely been reworked to become the state god of the Athenian Empire.
Right.
Yeah. That's fact she's got the Gorgon's mask here, which is originally not a mask, not cut off for a body. It was always a mask. That's one of her attributes. So she's got a child who's distinctly snaky, and sometimes you find as an Athenian fireplace there's Hephaestus and Athena represented, but that Athena could equally be connected with Hecate. That's a line I'm not really qualified to follow up, but I keep finding references to it.
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't seen that, but I could. Just in my mind, I could visualize, there's a type of connection because Athena tends to be, well, certainly with regard to the act of war. I mean, I feel like Athena is certainly, she's not Ares. I mean, she's got this whole more underground kind of strategy way of doing and directing things. And,
and the link with Hephaestus is connected with craft, which is again skill over brute strength. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And Hephaestus is he's also, well, I mean, he's got his own chthonic attributes as well. I mean, certainly, for sure. And because certainly, and I think actually you were the one who said this at one point, was the idea, and actually I read it somewhere else after you had said it, was that Hephaestus, that the idea of the blacksmiths or the craftsmen in a particular community having their legs broken so that they don't take their magical skill to another community and use it there.
Yeah, it's hard to know what all that's about because you find demons and gods with similar symbolism. Asmodeus is said to have a limp, for instance, and he's connected with rage, but possibly with fire as well. Demons with their legs turned backwards, or unusual feet in general. Hephaestus is definitely in there somewhere. I don't know if we used to hobble our blacksmiths at all, but there's some odd stuff going on with the early blacksmith guilds, which seem to have connected with royalty in a Hittite context. The head of the guild was Basilius, which literally means king. So then, the background to Hephaestus is extraordinarily deep, and comes from similar strata to what we know about men. The god, not the gender.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So
this stuff was anciently not antisocial and demonized, but honored and even connected with royalty and what was then the priesthood, which was more prophetic than just clerical. Yeah, it's an important strata. You're right about Cyprian, at least in one way. In the Confession of Saint Cyprian, the very first initiation, there's a long list of the initiations that he had as a pagan before he became a saint. It starts with the precinct of men, which has statues of Hecate. Some people even call it a precinct of Hecate. Arguable which of them, it's probably both. But yeah, that's the first of his initiations. He was promised at birth, blessed at birth, whatever, however it worked. A Hecate temple, absolutely. There's a Cyprian connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it's, I don't know, it's interesting, trying to untangle all that. The Athenian angle is interesting too, because with Athens, I always tend to think of them as being at least some of it, somewhat anticatonic. I mean, in the way that they went about certain things, like for example, Solon banning a lot of the death rituals, the weeping and the wailing at funerals, and that's
all got legislated, and wizards and prophets tend to get chucked out of the city, but they had a massive amount of it in their history. I mean, the fact that they were chucked out in the first place is important. Some great magician prophets came there and cleansed the city of plague in the early period, and one imagines that the Athenians liked that. And it is the Pelasgian layer of Athenian culture that interests me more than the later stuff where the city stage and philosopher kings and so on are posited. There's the common man, or the common family in their little house, the gods they venerated and had inherited from a domestic cult that went back generations. That's going to tell us more than the literati and the intellectuals at the top, who were often very caustic about traditions and beliefs in their culture and wanted to supplant them and replace them with other things. They may have had a case in some respects, but they're not helpful witnesses. Whereas archaeology can tell us a great deal that contradicts the elite's story about the place.
Well, it's interesting because when you talk about that, because I think about sort of the pre-city state kind of environment, where the oikos, so the household, is actually more important than, because once you get into the city state, it's, you still have the families and so forth, but it's different. It's more diverse, certainly, because you've got people coming in from different places, but the values of the state are a little bit different from the values of the household, which for me, where, that idea of the tribal leader or the tribal king or the person with lineage is important. And then you have, and the idea, well, even the female roles, where there's a, the woman who's supposed to bear children because it's part of, continuing the line, maintaining the oikos, keeping the household going, and I think the values change as you get into these larger kinds of city environments. It's the focus.
Social stability becomes the benchmark against what everything else has got to be measured, really. Whereas that's less the case in the older households and so on. And they used to be fairly internecine struggles, and people used funerals to say bad things about their enemies and so on. So the legislation was necessary in order to have a city-state, but that doesn't necessarily help us understand what the myths and stories and rituals of these gods and goddesses really entail, what they really grew from. Which is where I want to go. I mean, I don't want to reduce us to an anarcho-primitive states out there now where there's no social structure. That's not what I'm about. But the primal layer is necessarily explored. Nonetheless, you have to go there and examine this stuff. Or our gods just become part of the state religion generally. It's not there to liberate you. It's there to control and contain you.
Well, right, exactly,
Which
and
is
that's
my problem with pagan reconstructionists. Sorry.
No. That's good, because that's kind of to the point that I'm having, is that you need to go back and examine this, because when it comes down to it, any kind of work that you're really doing in this vein is hard work. It's not there to just reinforce your biases. It's not there to just make you feel good about yourself. It's like people who do, well, it's like people who even do work in like Buddhism or Hinduism or something, where, I remember having this woman who I used to work for, who she lived next door to this woman who worked for the Dalai Lama. And she's like, none of these people are ever peaceful. And I'm just like, yeah, well, that isn't the point. I mean, you think, oh, right, I've adopted a system, so now I'm this, or now I'm that. And that's not how any of it works at all. I mean, it's, and when you get involved with these kinds of deities, these kinds of beings, the work is very, very hard, and it generally doesn't, it's more apt to rip things apart than it is to kind of reinforce your whatever your biases are. No,
and if it doesn't, you're not doing it right.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep, and it's yeah. So that's interesting. So did you have any last thoughts?
Well, there's a lot of material to cover. I mean, we haven't really scratched the surface. I definitely recommend you talk to Georgi Mishev in future. I mean, he has a temple of Hecate built there. He knows the traditions of the area very well. Multilingual. But yeah, the goddess of the crossroads is a very important symbol, connecting with a lot of the material that I've presented, even where Hecate is not mentioned. Crossroads is a magical place, a liminal place. And I'd like to see Hecate as the goddess of the witches, with all the richness of that tradition, better understood. So absolutely game for that.
So great. Well, I think we're just about at an hour, so thanks very much for that. I'm probably going to stop the recording. We can stay on for a minute, but I'm going to stop the recording. And so thanks again so much, Jake. And and I hope everybody enjoyed this.